decided to use Scrum like in the Cairo airport in the middle of the night. There was like a dusk to dawn curfew and I was flown in. And I said, the only way I think I'm going to do this is with Scrum. I'm not going to use any of the words because, journalists would just like be really like, oh, some management fad. And I just used it. And it was within a few days, this sort of fractious group of individuals became a team. But I just wanted to tell these stories and share them with people so that they can take advantage of Scrum and not have this sort of in their head, like there's no way it works here. Because it's a universal framework for just human effort. It was birthed in the technology industry, but it applies everywhere. Making things visible has power, especially in today's world. A lot of the work we do in any sort of knowledge work, it's invisible. We don't know where it is. It's what is the state? How close is it to done? Are you stuck? And so what Scrum is trying to do with those boards and making other things visible is make the imaginary real. So you can really see what state everything is in. The only reason Scrum exists and the only reason to use it is not to do Scrum. I do not care about people doing Scrum. I care about results. And I think that Scrum is the best tool to get them those. Better results, lower risk, faster. And in my experience, Scrum is the best way of getting that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to another episode of the Bounce Podcast. This is a podcast about getting things done, getting results, and defining the future. My guest is J.J.Sutherland. He is the CEO of Scrum Inc., a consulting firm that uses Scrum, which we'll define in a moment, to deliver rapid results in companies across the globe. He is also the co-author of Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, written with his father, J.J.Sutherland, the co-creator of Scrum. Previously, JJ was an award-winning correspondent, producer, and Baghdad bureau chief for NPR. We have, by the way, a very interesting conversation about the times he's covered the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Arab Spring, and the aftermath of 2011 tsunami in Japan. And he has won the DuPont, Peabody, Edward R. Murrow, and Lowell Thomas Awards for his work. And he has a new book, the Scrum Fieldbook, a masterclass on accelerating performance, getting results, and defining the future is the topic of our show. So for those of you unfamiliar with the term Scrum, it's a process model created around 1993 as a faster, more effective way to create software in the tech industry. Since then, Scrum or Scrum hybrids have pretty much become the way the tech industry creates new products. The framework is now being used very successfully in general business practice outside of the world of technology. So this chat is in part a discovery process as to why that is. JJ says Scrum is the art of changing the possible, or what is possible. And I think after listening to this episode, you might join him in that belief. JJ was not only a great guest, but he's a very gifted writer. Really enjoyed the book, and it translates to audio. He is very articulate, and I really enjoyed his easy way of discussing what could have been a very nerdy topic, but it wasn't at all. Some great advice here on how to get things done. Great insights on teamwork, why projects fail, how they can succeed and be done in record time, and why Scrum applies everywhere, and why JJ considers Scrum a universal framework for human effort. So without further ado, here's JJ. JJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Obviously, you're the CEO of Scrum, so that's a consultancy firm. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, Scrum Inc. We do consulting and training all over the world.
And I'm a company. I'm having trouble either building this thing or
commercializing. Like you have a product, but you can't get it out the door, whatever reason. Or I want to get my teams to work together better, or I just want to get faster, or I have a real bad problem. I don't fix it.
So a company will bring you in for real world implementation or workshopping as to, hey, how do we work better as teams?
Yeah, exactly.
And you are the co-author of the first book that I read around, it was the only book I read around Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. Whenever that came out, I read it. I read it on a long, cross-country plane. I read the whole thing. It was really good. And you co-author with your father, J.J.Sutherland, who was the co-creator of Scrum.
Yes, exactly. Back in the early 90s, yeah.
And I want to ask you about that history real quickly. But you were also, in a prior life, I'm going to phrase it that way, you're award-winning correspondent, producer, And you were the Baghdad bureau chief of NPR.
Yeah, from 2004 to 2011, I was Baghdad bureau chief.
So you covered Iraq, Afghanistan, the Arab Spring.
Yeah, the Fukushima disaster in Japan, Libya, terrorist attacks in London, the Hezbollah Israeli conflict. What was that, 2006, 2007, 2006, I guess? All sorts of stuff.
Wow, man. And you won the DuPont Peabody?
A couple of DuPonts, 3 or 4 Peabodys, Lowell Thomas Award, Edward Murrow Award.
3 or 4 Peabody, yeah,
Well, it wasn't just me. It was a team of people.
How did you move from journalism into what you're doing now?
What happened was after the Arab Spring, so this was 2011, in January, I called up, I go to the Arab Spring, and I ran the Arab Spring coverage with Scrum. I didn't tell anybody that, but yeah, I mean, it's classic stuff we had. I actually put Post-it notes on the wall. What's the most important thing for us to do today? Okay. What's the next most important thing? Prioritize. We had, retrospectives, and I just said, okay, what went well in the past? We were doing like 12-hour sprints for the morning show and the evening shows. Like, what went well? What didn't go well? What's slowing us down? And like we had these impediments, and it could be, we need a better satellite hit, or one of our correspondents got picked up by the secret police. That's slowing us down. I mean, stuff like that. And so I did that because I'd taken the course years before with my father and became a certified Scrum Master and stuff. And I used it because people have been fighting, been arguing. Because think about it, broadcast correspondents at one level have egos, right? And they also see each other as competition. And at one level, that's true. There's only so many minutes in a broadcast. Someone's going to get them, someone won't. And really, but using, I decided to use Scrum like in the Cairo airport in the middle of the night. There was like a dusted on curfew, and it's flown in. And I said, the only way I think I'm going to do this is with Scrum. I'm not going to use any of the words because journalists would just like be really like, oh, there's some management fad. And I just used it, and it was within a few days, this sort of fractious group of individuals became a team. And that was an intense period. That was like a month-long, pretty intense period. I was the senior producer, which is an odd role because you're accountable, but you're no one's boss.
So then how did you get the buy-in and get everybody to kind of, let's do this process?
Because I just started doing it. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't say, hey, we're going to try something different. I just sort of said, hey, what's the most important thing we have to do today? Okay. And then I just sort of, had these, stand-ups. I was like, okay, every, twice a day, we're going to get together for 15 minutes, just talk about, because this is such a fast-moving story. I didn't use any of the words. I didn't even say there was a process. I just did it. And after that, I came back, and it was like and I had a 2-year-old at this point. And then about 2 weeks later, I was supposed to be going back to cover Libya, because that was happening. And then the tidal wave in Japan and the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened. So I go over to Japan for a month. Then I come back home for a week or two. Then I go to Libya. Then I come back, do some other stuff. Like 3 weeks later, I'm back in Libya. So I was gone for about 6 months of 2011. And Libya was crazy, just total and complete chaos. There was no organization. There was because Gaddafi had like completely atomized the society. So they looted all the armories. This is in Benghazi. They did it everywhere. And so every day at around 4:30, the citizens of Benghazi would walk in front of the hotel where all the reporters and international people were staying and fire all the weapons off into the air. And, and they'd fire them not really realizing what goes up must come down. And one day, they were shooting, bullets would go through your window every once in a while. And I was doing an edit. And I wasn't afraid. I was annoyed. And a mentor of mine had said in that business is that if you're ever not afraid, you don't understand where you are and what's happening, and you should get out. And so the next day, or a couple days later, they wanted me to get on a plane in Benghazi and go from Benghazi to Tunisia, sneak across the border into Libya, go up into the mountains and hook up with the Zintani tribesmen in the mountains and ride with them into Tripoli for the final battle. And I said, what's the medevac plan for that? And they're like, oh, there is none. And I get on this plane, I land in Tunisia, and I don't get off the plane. I stay on the plane, and it flies me to Malta. And I land in Malta, and I said, wow, my career's over. Can't do that. And I got to figure out what I'm going to do next. And I went to a buddy of mine who's a literary agent, and I said, well, maybe I can write a book. And I said, I could write, a book about war. I could write a book about the Middle East. I could do something about Japan. Bunch of different things. Or I said, there was this Scrum thing my father does. I'd love to write a book with him, just to capture his stories. And he said, what do I think I should do, Howard? And Howard goes, do you want to leave NPR, JJ? I said, yeah. He goes, write the Scrum book. And so that's what I spent the next few years doing. And that was the book that because before that book was published, Scrum Inc. was a really small company, 4 or 5 people, and mainly one-man shop with my father doing stuff. And that book came out, and boom, all of a sudden, it's companies like 3M or Toyota, or those companies started calling us and saying, "Hey, can you help us?" And so since then, we've doubled in size pretty much every year. And so, over the past 5 years, I have all these stories of Scrum being used in all these different areas. No matter what it is, banking or automotive or aerospace or defense or all sorts of stuff. Banking, insurance. One of the companies I work with makes beer, right? And these aren't even technology. I mean, they're kind of technology companies because every company is a technology company these days. But they have nothing to do with software development. And I really wanted to capture those stories from all the people who work at Scrum Inc. and tell them to share them with the world, because I'm often asked, JJ, so this Scrum thing, that's good for software, but in my, incredibly complicated world, there's no way it can be applied here. And it can be. There's one kind of story I tell in the book about Saab Aerospace. They're building a fighter plane in Scrum. And my answer now these days is, I'm not sure what you're doing, but I'm pretty sure it's not as complicated as building a fighter plane. And I used to say that all the time. And then one of the companies that makes nuclear submarines called me up. And I said, okay, that's more complicated. But I just wanted to tell these stories and share them with people so that they can take advantage of Scrum and not have this sort of in their head, like there's no way it works here. Because it's a universal framework for just human effort. It was birthed in the technology industry, but it applies everywhere.
So why this book?
So after Twice Working Half the Time, we started all these things. And so for the past 5 years, it's just all these stories just kept coming. And at Scrum Inc., we kept on working with all these different kinds of companies. And I just kept on capturing the stories. I said, I want to tell that story. I want to tell that story. I want to tell that story. And then when I had enough, I said, okay, let's put them together in a book. And that way I can arm people who want to do Agile, Scrum, and they can argue with their managers and say, hey, it does work in all these different places. Or I wanted, some executive to pick up the book on an airplane like you did and say, how can I use this in my company? I was taking the Acela yesterday, and I ran into this guy, and his company makes refrigeration stuff, like for supermarkets, like the refrigerators. And I was talking to him. He's like, yeah, I could totally use Scrum in that. I totally get it. And I'm like, exactly. It's just organizing people.
Could you define Scrum for us?
Sure. So Scrum is a lightweight framework, because any sort of process or methodology or whatever is waste, right? In a perfect world, you'd have none. So this is the lightest weight framework that we've been able to find. If someone finds a faster one, I'm more than happy to do it. That is focused on a few things. One is getting stuff done. So we run these things called sprints, which are 1 to 4 weeks. You pick your length and you stick with it. I like 1 week sprints. That's what I work on. And so every week at the beginning of the sprint, the team that I'm on, we pull what work we think we can get done on that week. And it goes into, it gets posted on a wall under a do column, like on Post-it notes, all the different things we think we can accomplish that week. And then during the week, we move them into the doing as we go through them. And they're prioritized in priority order by business value, or whatever kind of value you have. And then when they're done, they move to the done column. But when they're done, they're totally done. They could be shipped to a customer. That's the ideal. And what it allows teams to do is to inspect and adapt. Inspect and adapt what they're making, because you're showing it to a customer or stakeholder or whoever and say, hey, are we doing this right? But also how they're making it. Because part of what Scrum is looking for continuous improvement, not only of the product, but of the process. How is this team working together? Can we work together better? Can we get faster? How we want to do high quality, faster, cheap?
So there'll be CEOs walking down hallways of various companies or managers, and they look in a room, there's a whiteboard and all these Post-it notes. It's probably kind of a Scrum process or some kind of project that's being scrummed. There's a backlog, right, of things that need to be done. And then, as you said, that kind of moves forward. This process, it was birthed out of kind of software technology companies, right? But did it have earlier origins? I think your father was in a jet fighter, right?
Yeah, he was a fighter pilot. So actually, even before that, he was at West Point. And at West Point, the cadets do a lot of marching. They have their shiny brass uniforms and they march. But each company is judged every parade, and they do this like 3 times a week for the tourists and the brass and all that kind of stuff on how well they march. And this is really important to them. And my father's company was Company L2, which was known as the Loose Deuce, because they had been the worst company at marching since the Civil War for 100 years. And think about that. They're completely replaced every 4 years, but that culture of mediocrity was still baked in. And so my father became the training officer. There's new leadership of the company. They said, well, we're going to change that. So of course they think, well, let's make them march longer and harder in the snow and at night. And nothing worked. They were still the worst. And so what my father decided to do was he took the reasons why the company was marked down, because all the other training officers were the ones who rated. All the training officers looked at each company and gave them 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 on different sort of aspects and said, well, we marked them down because, Charlie stuck his sword in the dirt, or, that turn was sloppy, and everything. So he put them on a bulletin board and put that bulletin board in a place where every single cadet had to walk by it every day in the barracks. And apparently that board ended up in the bushes more than once. But as they did it, by making it visible, they started to change, and they changed rapidly. And within a few months, they'd gone from being the worst company to being the best company. And right around that time was when General MacArthur died. And so the best company of cadets went and buried General MacArthur in Richmond, Virginia. And L2 went and did that. So that was sort of his first experience of making things visible has power. Especially in today's world, a lot of the work we do in any sort of knowledge work, it's invisible. We don't know where it is. It's what is the state? How close is it to done? Are you stuck? And so what Scrum is trying to do with those boards and making other things visible is make the imaginary real, so you can really see what state everything is in. And then he became a fighter pilot. He went to the Air Force and he flew 100 missions over North Vietnam. And when he got to North Vietnam, the casualty rate for fighter pilots was 50%. Half of them didn't come back. And he said, don't want to do that. Don't want to have that happen to my group. And so what he realized the other pilots were doing, the other groups were doing, is they would follow this plan. They would go across the border. They'd say, turn here, fly 100 miles this way, drop your bombs or whatever, and then fly out according to this very planned out thing. And what he said is, we're not following a plan ever. So as soon as they crossed the border, they would instantly go into evasive maneuvers constantly until they went over their target, bang, were steady for a second, and then they would do evasive maneuvers out. So he realized that by having a rigid plan, the enemy knew exactly what you were going to do, and that you had to constantly change your plan. Because that's what happens. And what happens a lot in business is they'll have these, rigid plans that go years out. Like, this is exactly what we're going to do. And the thing is, and I understand why, because people say, well, I'm smart. I'm going to sit down. I'm really going to think about it. I'm going to create a really good plan. And that's what we're going to do. And the thing is, it's the illusion of control, because things will change no matter what. And if you have a really detailed plan, you fall in love with your plan, even if your plan is the wrong thing to do. And then after the military, he retired and he went into cancer research at the University of Colorado Medical School. He got his doctorate there. And there he started working with computers because he got the assignment of mathematically modeling cancer, because they wanted to know what was the stages cancer went through to get from, first, it gets exposed to radiation or whatever, and then it turns into a solid tumor. And the interesting thing is it goes through a series of stable states from one to the other. It's not really a linear curve. And so he did that, and he's working in doing some very complicated statistical work. And then, as he likes to say it, this bank came to him with an offer, my mother couldn't refuse, which was to roll out ATM networks in the early 80s. And so as he did that, he's noticed the people were always late. The software people are just miserable. They're getting yelled at all the time. And he reminded him, he said, of when he was a fighter pilot, when he taught young pilots how to land planes. He says, you land too early, smoking hole in the ground. You land too late, you slide off the runway, and there's always bad things at the other end of the runway. And so, but as you come in for the landing, you're constantly adjusting in real time, yaw, angle of attack, airspeed. So you come in just in time. And so we invented what's now called a burn down chart. So you have real time data. Are we going to be done on time? Are we going to finish what we said we were going to finish in this sprint? Another way of making work visible. And then over the years, I mean, he was CTO or a VP of engineering of 11 different software companies, ranging from startups to what the company that got bought is now GE Healthcare. And in the early 90s, he was working at this company, the ESO Corporation, and they were working on a big product. And they realized there was no way they were going to get it done unless they changed the way they were working. They came up with this idea, which they called Scrum, based on the rugby formation, when everyone links arms and pushes together. And over the next few years, first it was just his team, but that team got really, really good. And over the next, in the 90s, it spread through the software industry just because it developed better software, high quality, much faster. People were happier. It was a better way of doing things. And then I would say in the early 2000s, it sort of exploded across the software industry from like 2000, 2008. So in 2014, when our last book, Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, came out, it had really become the dominant way of software development. All the companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Dropbox, all those companies, and that is the way work was done. You talk to young engineers in Silicon Valley these days, and you explain like traditional project management to them, and they're like, do they have buggy whips too? I don't even understand how you could do anything like that. I have no idea what came before it. And over the past 5 years, since our last book, we've started working at Scrum Inc. with companies that are making rocket ships, companies that are making agricultural machinery, automotive, banks, defense, military, airplanes. I have a really big company that makes beer. You make beer with Scrum. And it spread globally. And so what I wanted to do with this book is to really tell those stories, because we've had a lot, and how like most of my business now has nothing to do with software development these days, because it's sort of penetrated all of software development. It has to do with other products or even services or people in the government or any kind of thing you can imagine, because it's based on so many years of research on what the best way it is for teams to work together. It didn't really invent anything. It just formalized a system that was able to call on the best patterns for teams to work together to deliver value.
I want to talk about problem solving and how Scrum helps you do that. It seems that problems, at least for companies, let's talk about teams and companies. I think you make the case that they're pretty much systemic. In other words, you have good people, they're probably very smart, tons of resources, money-wise or whatever, because you're talking about some fairly big companies, some of the case studies, right? So they got everything they need, right? So why are these projects that they're trying to implement failing?
There are sort of three main things I think about that really are the reason people can't get anything done. The first is prioritization. No one prioritizes. Nobody. It's amazing. In the book, I quote one of our consultants, this guy named Avi Schneier, and he always goes, he's the lead principal consultant for us. And he says, stop starting, start finishing. Don't continue to start stuff, because people will come in, we're going to have 100 projects, and each person is working on 5 of them at once because their skills are specialized and they need it. And when you spread yourself that thing, nothing gets done. And so you have to force, and the really interesting thing when I was doing the research for this book is the word priorities wasn't a word until the 1940s, because it comes from a Latin root word. It comes from the Latin a priori. It comes before. Having more than one is nonsensical. And so you have to prioritize. And that's the first thing. That has nothing to do with Scrum. That's just basic business sense. If you don't prioritize, if you don't focus, nothing will get done. And then the second thing is people don't get stuff done. They don't deliver regularly, because nowadays, and certainly in the technology space, people deliver all the time. But you talk to some companies, and they're like, well, how often can you release stuff? They're like, I don't know, once every 6 months, once a quarter. Amazon, which has 3,000 Scrum teams, can release features more than once a second. And I'm not saying Amazon's a perfect company. They're not. But they are fast. And I've worked with a few groups inside of Amazon, and they are really, really fast. And this is why if it's even rumored Amazon's going to get into your space, everyone freaks out. Like, look at all the healthcare mergers that are happening right now, multi-billion-dollar things, because Amazon said, oh, we might get into that business, the pharmaceutical business. Maybe we'll do that. And everyone freaks out because they know they aren't as fast. So I heard one of our people was in Germany, and this is a story I heard. I've not verified it myself, just full disclosure. But that he was training some people, and some people from one of the big banks in Germany came up to him, and they said, well, we have to go Scrum because Amazon has started doing personal loans in Germany. Like small ones, $5,000, $10,000. And they can approve people in 3 seconds. It takes us 3 weeks. We've lost that business forever.
So can I park on the prioritization? Is there Scrum-centric or do you have any secret sauce as to how to best prioritize? Or is it a matter of just looking at what is the outcome management or the board?
What you need to do is, this is how I prioritize, is start with what problem are you trying to solve and for whom? And then sort of test your assumptions. Like, is our solution good enough that they'll buy our solution instead of what they have already? And then to start there, and then you work backwards and say, okay, what is the value chain, the whole value stream to deliver that service or deliver that product? And what do we need to do it? And how much value will it bring? So you have some sort of sense of the effort it will take, and you have some sense of what the value it will bring you. And they say, okay, well, divide value by effort, and it becomes a pretty easy calculation to which things you should do first. Now, obviously, there's some things that have to be serialized, that have to build this before you can do that. But you really want to say is, how valuable is it, and how hard is it to do?
Is this both pre-backlog and into the backlog?
Yeah, it goes into the backlog. You go into the backlog. You have a bunch of ideas. Say, okay, let's put testing this idea into the backlog. How are we going to test our hypothesis? And by getting these tight feedback loops, because this is why I like working in 1 week sprints. And I mean, thinking about planning something, my work for the next month makes my head explode. I've been doing these 1 week sprints for 8 years. So, but you have to prioritize, and people don't prioritize because they don't know what's going to work and what isn't. And so they spread themselves really thin and nothing gets done. A sprint is a set period of time. The most common is 2 weeks. I do 1 week. I try to get all my customers to do 1 week sprints. And what that is at the beginning of a sprint, a team looks at the big backlog, the big to-do list of stuff that needs to be done. And they say, okay, how much do we think we can get done in the next week? And then they pull that in, and they start working on it. And then at the end of the week, they show it to their product owner or their stakeholder or their customer or whoever's getting value from what they're making, no matter what it is. And they say, well, we got this much stuff done. Okay, let's reflect on first what we made. Is it the right thing? Because often it's not. And you show it to somebody because no one knows what they want really. Sure, they'll describe it in a requirements document really clearly and everything, but then you show it to them like, oh, no, that's not what we want. What we want is this. And so you sort of optimize what you're doing, optimize what you're making, or product or service, or whatever you're doing. Then also you say, how are we doing it? Let's optimize our process as well. Let's change how we're working as a team. Or what's the friction in, what is slowing us down? Is it something outside the team? Is it something in the team? How do we fix that? So you're optimizing what you're doing, and you're optimizing how you do it. So the next sprint, oh, we got faster. Instead of pulling 10 things in, now we can pull in 11. And projects are big. They take longer than a week, right? But every week you check in. Every week you check in, are we doing the right thing?
It's not necessarily this thing is done. It's just the time that you've allocated to work.
You define done for different things. I mean, some people release, this is why your iPhone updates 5 times a day, because that's what these teams are doing, right? They're releasing all the time. Or as I said, Amazon's releasing once a second. They're doing continuous delivery. Now, there are some things that take a long time, like building a rocket. Rockets are complicated, I've learned. I work with a rocket company out in California. But okay, well, what if done here for this week is let's get the motor up on the test bed?
That would be the goal of an end of a sprint?
Yeah, end of a sprint. And then maybe the next sprint's goal is we ran 5, tests, pressure tests on the engine.
One of the questions, so I was talking to my friend, is, so here's some of the problems that we've seen and specifically he's seen with the application of the Scrum process. And that is, how do you deal with reactivity?
So the role of product owner in Scrum is the person who prioritizes what the team's going to do. They have two things they have to think about. First of all, what's the short term? It's firefighting, right? There's a fire, we got to put it out, we got to deal with it. And secondly, it's the long term, fire prevention. And so in that sprint backlog is going to be coming, some things are for the future, like doing a big platform upgrade or whatever it is. And some things are, a big customer is upset about something, we've got to fix that. So it's a constant balancing act.
And this all goes in the backlog, and then you're prioritizing that backlog?
You're prioritizing that backlog, but it's a whole system. So you don't tell the team how much work they can do in a sprint. They decide. But what gets prioritized is a product owner. It's one person, and they are accountable for the success or failure of the product or service.
Is that the key to managing that type of constantly just reacting to changes?
Yeah, you need Scrum lives or dies by product owners, the person who defines what is valuable and then prioritizes it. And it's a hard role. And they have to interact with the customers. They have to interact with the teams. They have to have a vision of where they're going. And, it may be, they're talking to the customers and the customers are really, they want something else, but the product owner has a vision. It's like, they don't even know they want this, but this is going to solve problems for them. Because what a great product owner does is goes out and talks to people and says, what are your problems? Don't tell me what product you want. Just tell me, what problems are you trying to solve? What's painful, right? What's a sticking point in your life? And say, okay, I can get a vision of something totally different. You say, I want, it was like the classic Henry Ford thing. If I ask people what they want, they'd say a faster horse, and I gave them a car. But it's sort of a good product owner go, they just want transportation. And I have a vision for doing something like that.
The feedback I've gotten is that there's a squeeze on the front end and the back end. There's a squeeze on the planning sometimes, and on the front end and on the QA gets squeezed out on the back end, or it hasn't been put into the plan. You know what I mean? Where you're going to need 3 days of testing at the end of this, what the engineer is saying is done. It's not done.
It's not done. QA has to be on the Scrum team. The Scrum team needs to be a cross-functional team that has all of the skills necessary to deliver it, including testing. Anybody who has a separate test team, that's crazy these days. And I mean, software companies that do that are just not being professional. That's just crazy. Because you're totally right. It gets cranked at the end, put in the end, and then all these defects pop up. Then they go back to the developers and say, there are these defects. And so if you wait till the end to test for quality, and then you go back, let's say the developers or engineers deliver something that has a defect. And then 3 weeks later, the testers bring it back and say, hey, this has this defect. Well, now, not only do you have to fix that defect, that problem, but there are 100 other things that have been built on top of that thing that depend on it being broken exactly that way.
So how do you fix that?
You define done as potentially shippable. It's been designed, it's been built, it's been tested. That's what done means. We could give it to somebody.
Okay. So when we run into these kind of problems, there has been a problem up front in defining done.
Yeah, in defining what are the acceptance criteria. And that sort of the upfront part is you only need to plan, you sort of have a vision of what you want to do, but you only need to break it down for the next 2 or 3 sprints. Because you break down the whole thing, that's just waste, because you're going to change your mind. You're going to learn something. We know that in software, we have really good numbers because it's easy to track this stuff, that something like 2/3 of requirements change during development. And we also know that 2/3 of features are rarely or never used. And we know that in software because we can measure it really easily. And so by releasing iteratively, you can say, that's not what the customers. I know one company right now, a software as a service company, pretty big one, and they are actually taking features out of their product because it had gotten too complicated. And people's like, I don't want to buy that. That's for the professionals. It's not for me. Can you imagine someone who's spent 2 years working on something really cool and intricate and and neat, and no one wants it?
So how do you launch a new product? So using this framework, the Scrum framework, a new product or a big product, what's the difference in iteration, implementation of something or changing something versus a brand new thing? For example, instead of going from an iPhone 10 to an iPhone 11, how do you launch the very first iPhone, this concept defining smartphone?
Scrum is based to allow you to innovate. because that's the point, is to make new, incredible things, right? That's what every company wants to do. And the thing is, you say, I have a vision for this amazing thing. Like I imagine Steve Jobs, I'm going to put a supercomputer in everyone's pocket. It's going to be amazing. And everyone's like, you got to be crazy, Steve. I'm sure that they said that. But he had this thing. It's like, no, this is going to be better, which is great. And I know Apple uses Scrum. But each time say, okay, this is my vision. And then each couple of weeks, you're going to say, this is how close we've progressed. Because this is how we've gotten there. Because it's always important to have a long-term goal, a long-term vision. This is where I see this thing in a year. Well, what does that mean we're going to do tomorrow? How do we measure our progress towards that goal?
That, JJ, is what I want you to elaborate on, because the question is around a CEO wants a launch event date, September 2020, 15th. I'm going on stage. We're launching this thing. But you have sprints.
Yeah. So you say, okay, yeah, so we have to be ready by September 15th, because we're going to get on stage and show the new iPhone. And what the engineers would say, Scrum things, they know how much work they can get done each sprint, right? It's measured. They have so much data on their performance because they measure it all the time. And so they'll look at the CEO and say, well, by that date, we can have this set of features if our what we call velocity, which is just how many things can you get done each sprint. If given our current state, this is the number of features we have that will be done. Is that good enough? Are they the ones you want? Or it will take X more time to do other features. Maybe we'll do, a maintenance. So I was like, yeah, okay, that's going to take 20 sprints to get this stuff done. And we know exactly how much we can get done every sprint. Because I was at this big financial company. I'm trying to figure out how to describe them without giving anything away. They have big financial products, and their customers are like states and airlines and really big companies, right? And they brought me in to say, okay, they had this big project that had to be done by a certain date. It was it was a regulatory thing. They had to be finished with this thing at a certain date. It's like January 1st, a couple years ago. And so I said, we want you to come in and say, how agile are we? How good is our Scrum? And how can we get better? Because we're worried that we're not going to hit the date. And what can we do? So I went in and I talked to a bunch of people and I watched them plan. I sort of saw how they did it. And I talked to one Scrum Master. And a Scrum Master is just the person who's responsible for helping the team to get fast, to remove the roadblocks that are stopping the team or slowing the team down. And I said, okay, your team, what's the velocity of your team? How much stuff did you get done? How many things on this backlog did you get done last sprint, last 2 weeks? And they're like, 17. It's like, great. How many things are you going to plan to do next sprint? He says, 185. And I said, really? I'm going to call you in a couple weeks, see how that went. So I called him a couple weeks later, and he said, well, what'd you get done? He goes, 17. I said, how many are you pulling into the next sprint? 190. I was like, why? Because management says we have to meet the date. To meet the date, we have to have this many things done. And so I went to management and I said, here's your situation. Today, you can pick which customers you're going to lose. On that deadline, you might lose all of them. And that's one of the things that Scrum does. Because of that transparency and visibility, you know that early instead of 2 weeks before it's supposed to go out the door, because you can pick which features you're going to do and which ones they value the most. If you say, oh, we're going to do all of them, you might lose all of them because you won't be developing the right features. You won't be doing it because there's a limit to what you can do. But they had that knowledge 9 months or 6 months before it was supposed to go out the door, where they can actually do something different. They didn't. But you have that knowledge before because you know how much stuff the team's going to get done each sprint. You know how much stuff there is to do. They've estimated how hard it is to do it. You say, okay, this is how much stuff we're going to get done by that date, given the current state. Now, we either change the current state or we reduce scope.
So this is great, JJ, because it's a way to get management buy-in. Because the other feedback I gotten was the problem with, so let's say you have a president and a CEO and or a product manager and a CEO, and the CEO has the launch date, but you know the reality. To get that kind of buy-in, that's a good point, to kind of do those calculations.
Yeah, I mean, CEOs, they don't care about Scrum at all. They care about results. If Scrum happens to be the way to drive results, fantastic. But they want results, lower risk. And that's what Scrum is. And they're actually usually really easy to convince. I deal with a lot of C-suite people, and they're really easy to convince because they're like, okay, we're going to do this. You're going to know when things are going to be done. You're going to have transparency into your organization. You're going to be able to steer your organization, and you'll know what's going to happen. And I'm like, well, great. I was working with one CEO at 3M, and one of the divisions of 3M, and she was saying what Scrum did was allowed her to see, because all those backlogs are transparent. She said, well, I know what I think is the top priority, but when it filters down through 5 layers of management, sometimes it just doesn't get done, or the priorities get misinterpreted, and the teams are working on something else that I don't want. We actually found a group of 3 or 4 teams that were working on something where the market window had passed 2 years ago, and no one knew. The teams didn't know. CEO didn't know. It's like dark work. And so, but now, because all the backlogs are visible, I can steer the company. I know exactly what's happening. I know exactly when what I want to get done is going to get done. Because before, it's like, is it going to get done by this deadline? If you set a deadline, yeah, stuff will get done, but people will work nights and weekends. They'll go on death marches. You're going to have tons of quality issues. You're going to get burnout. And man, I think one of the other things that is really leading to the adoption of Scrum, because especially if you're in the technology industry and you have technological skills, you can get any job you want. You can walk out the door tomorrow. And so one thing Scrum does is have this sort of sustainable pace. And so people are happier. But to get that, they have to deliver. That's what my father said with the first Scrum team. And he said, you know what, don't you hate management yelling at you and sales, so when is this stuff going to be done, and banging on tables and making you work nights and weekends? They're like, yeah. He's like, I will make all of that go away, but you have to deliver. If you don't deliver, it's all coming back.
You have some really good information around decision-making and decision-making time. And in your book, you talk about for projects, the average time it takes to make a decision, where the average time it takes to make a decision is greater than 5 hours, there's a success rate of just 18%. And if that decision time averages less than an hour, project success rates rise to 58%. And then you have this great phrase called deterministic chaos. So is it just a matter from a decision? Because as I was reading it, there really wasn't here's how to make a decision. It was just move forward.
Make a decision. Because found it, iterate, you probably make the wrong decision, or it's halfway good. But a good decision, a decent decision today is infinitely preferable than a perfect one in 2 months. That data comes out of the Standish Group, and they've been monitoring projects for 20 years at this point. And they have a huge database of project success and failure rate. And because I was talking to Jim Johnson, the CEO of the Standish Group, and he said, I know that agile projects are far more likely to succeed and less likely to fail. But he wanted to know why. Like, what is it that Scrum does? And he came to this when he sliced his data set it was decision-making time. Because he said, JJ, projects don't die all at once in a blaze of glory. They die a day at a time. And his rule of thumb is, he says, is for every $1 million, or every $1,000 you put into a project, you're going to have to make a decision. That's sort of what his experience has told him. So if you have a $10 million project, that's 10,000 decisions. And if those decisions take you 2 weeks because you got to wait for the committee to meet, versus a decision taking under an hour because you have an empowered team being able to do it, making slow decisions is the death of a company.
You asked the Navy commander, John Haas, he adopted Scrum, right? And had great success with it. You asked him, what was one of the most important or benefits of doing that? And he said that it turned the decision into experiments, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and because you have an hypothesis, you're doing an experiment, and then you see, you're right. I was talking to him day before yesterday, and I was talking to him. I was going to dinner with him, and this guy's a Navy SEAL, and they said their insight is that you want these tight feedback loops, like feedback from your customer. And they said in combat, the enemy is your customer, because they will let you know whether you're doing the right thing really quickly.
Why would a Scrum implementation fail? Or what are you seeing a lot?
The most common reason, and we touched on this earlier, is bad product owners. People who don't know what the customer wants. They don't have enough time, because I see this a lot. People's like, oh, well, you're a busy manager, but now I'm going to add more work. You're going to be the product owner for this thing too. So you have to spend it, because product owner is a full-time job. And so, but if you have bad product owners making the wrong thing, things fail. You remember Nokia Mobile? They had really, really good Scrum teams. going really, really fast, making the wrong thing. So, and that's the product owner's job. So that's the first one. Then the next one I see, and this is part of the reason I wrote this book, was to combat this. Have you ever heard of cargo cults?
Yeah, that's from South Pacific.
Yeah, so in the South Pacific during World War II, the Navy would come in, and build a huge base on these islands. And the people who lived on these islands were like, what is this? The huge military base was hundreds of thousands of Americans. And all of this stuff, all of this cargo was coming in, food, medicine, supplies. It was amazing to them. And then, of course, the war ended, the Americans left. And they sort of brought in this character into their native religion and made him sort of the Messiah figure. And the character's name is John Frum. And I swear I'm not making this up. John from America. And this still goes on. And so they John from America, because hi, I'm John from America or Minnesota or whatever. So John Frum is their Messiah figure in their religion. And they said, why did all the cargo stop? You know what? When the Americans were here, there were airports, right? Runways. So if we build it perfectly enough, John Frum will bring back the cargo. And so they started to construct these fake runways in the middle of the jungle with, torches as the runway lights. They build, out of wood and of course, in classic things, the reason the Messiah doesn't show up is we haven't done it perfectly enough yet. Well, you sort of said this when we were talking before we were recording that, there's sort of sometimes people get really into Scrum and they sort of adopt it and they almost like they sort of have this religious cultish kind of sound to them. So I've gone into companies where, there's a lot of post notes and they do all of the events of Scrum and they do Scrum and they have all these meetings and they forget what it's for. It's not to do Scrum. It's to deliver value quickly. And so I see that if people just sort of, we're just doing all this thing, listen, I'm not a kumbaya kind of guy. I do not want to sit around the fireplace and hold hands because I'm the CEO of a company. And in this book, I want to tell other CEOs and tell other managers, the point of Scrum is to get stuff done. CEOs do not care about Scrum. They care about results. And it's like your certification or any of that stuff doesn't matter. Results matter. Lower risk matters. Speed matters. I see people, they get pieces of Scrum, like, we'll do a daily stand-up or we'll do, this. We don't want to do, one or the other of the events, like a retrospective or whatever. And they don't, and then they're like, well, we haven't got these productivity gains that JJ promised in his book. It's like, because you didn't do it all.
So let's talk about this because that was the other feedback I got. I mean, do you have to have a daily? Can you do every other day?
Sure you can. It's not going to be as good. I know groups that do it like 3 times a week or twice a week because they don't want to do it every day. You won't have the transparency and the ability to remove waste from the system every day. I mean, you can, sure. And it'll probably be a little bit better.
Because you may miss an opportunity for someone to say something. So even if it's rote and things are going well, which I think it may seem like a waste of time. Why are we meeting? Everything's going great. You know what I mean?
Well, the only thing is, the other thing about all the meetings in Scrum, they're time boxed. 15 minutes, guaranteed 15 minutes is the daily stand-up or the daily Scrum. So you can't take 15 minutes. I would say the other thing one of the things that comes out of the daily Scrum is what we call impediments, just things that are slowing the teams down. Like what is the friction in the system that is making it hard to get stuff done? And then this role called the Scrum Masters, their job is to get rid of it. That's their entire job because that's what accelerates the team. But if some team raises one of these impediments, one of these friction points, and then it just sits there and never gets dealt with, that's when the cynicism comes in, when they don't actually try to fix things. Because Scrum is at one level is designed to reveal problems, and you start doing it. All of these problems are going to come up, and you're like, oh, that's Scrum's fault. No, you always had the problems. They just weren't visible. It's like a fish in water. And like whenever I hire someone new, they say, well, I'm drinking from a fire hose here. I can't just. And I said, no. I want to hear what you think about the company because you have the most valuable perspective. You're new and you can see the stupid stuff we're doing and tell us not to do it.
Yeah. You actually talk about attitudes and mindsets through this thing. And I really want to ask you about that because you talk about you need to strip cynicism. And we're all so cynical. I know I am. You need to have an open mind. You need to have a flexible mindset. You need to dare to be courageous. It takes courage to make things or even propose something new, and then it takes courage to kind of see it through and finish it. And there's a whole section on deciding how best to decide. And then it takes a lot of courage to get feedback. What if what I do sucks? Well, you kind of want to know that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I see it all the time. People are so afraid. Well, what if I show it to somebody and it's horrible? I'm like, that's okay. It's horrible whether you show it to them or not. Because it's sort of, instead of being sort of having this blame-seeking attitude, it's like, oh, who's at fault here for this thing being horrible? It's a solution-seeking mindset. How do we make it better? Or whether maybe just throw that idea away and try something else because that was a bad idea. That's okay. That's fine. I have bad ideas all the time, but I test them out and say, oh, that really was a bad idea. Let's not do that.
Could you do everything technically right from a standpoint of implementing the Scrum process and get it wrong because of the mindsets are not flexible or off?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I mean, I've seen people who do Scrum perfectly, but without that mindset of creating something new, you mentioned cynicism, and basically cynicism, listen, I was a journalist for 20 years. Cynicism was my stock in trade, right? And you want journalists to be cynical. But if you're trying to create something new, if you're trying to really do something well, being cynical about it, you can't do it because what cynicism is an emotional distancing yourself from something. So if it does fail, so it's like, see, I always knew it would fail, right? It wouldn't work. But if you're trying something new, and you said this earlier, it does take courage. Like if you have a vision for a new idea or a new product or a new system or a new way of working, and you have to get people really excited about it because you don't know. It's somewhere out there in the mist, and you got to inspire them to say, we're going. And that takes courage and passion. And if you're cynical about it, you can't do it. You can't be innovative. All you're going to do is have a bunch of people hanging out. And you can do Scrum perfect. I've seen that. I've seen people do Scrum perfect. All the events, all the different things. They have the roles. They have a lot of sticky notes. But they don't remember that the only reason Scrum exists and the only reason to use it is not to do Scrum. I do not care about people doing Scrum. I care about results. And I think that Scrum is the best tool to get them those. Better results, lower risk, faster. And in my experience, Scrum is the best way of getting that. But if there is a better way, I am all about that because at the end of the day, it's getting stuff of value. And whether you're planning a wedding or making a Thanksgiving dinner or coming up with a new product or a satellite, whatever it is, you want value. And what's really interesting about people is one of the things that makes people happy, one of the things that brings us joy in life is doing valuable work well. It's really interesting. There's a ton of research on this. But doing work well that's valuable inspires people. That people love that feeling inside. Doing work that isn't valuable, even no matter how well you do it, kind of depresses us. And so you have to have that mind shift of we're going to do this, and it is scary, right? What if I fail? Like one of the things I always say is, because fear, real fear, and I know fear. I was in war for a long time, and wars are scary. But whenever you're trying something, you have to have courageous to go over that fear because it's like, what if I fail? What if I lose my job? What will my coworkers think of me if I fail? What will my family think about me if I fail? What will my father think about me if I fail? That's fear. That's real fear. And to do something new, you have to get through that.
So you faced fear in your job as a journalist, bullets and bombs and, a lot of dangerous places. Then you changed careers. Was there any fear there? And how did those two differ?
Absolutely, there was fear. I'm leaving something that I'd done my entire professional life to do something completely different. And when you're a war correspondent or a producer, a lot of your self-identity is wrapped up in that, right? Because that's like you're at a dinner party and you say, I just got back from a war zone. Like, oh, you're cool, right? That's a nice ego hit, right? There's a whole bunch of ego wrapped up in that. To get through that, I said, well, to prove to myself that I can do this, I need to do this well. I need to show myself first that I can go into a completely different arena using some of the same skills I used, but applying them in such a different place. And I did it. But it took a couple years. It took a few years for me to really move through that. You come out of war, you're kind of damaged. You are.
So you had that and the change.
And the change. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work with my father and to write a book with him, which was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. To work with my father as an adult, right? Not the sort of like there's still the son-father relationship, and I'm grateful, really incredibly grateful to him for that. And what I've done is proven to myself, proven to my father, proven to my family, proven to my customers, I am good at this. I'm really good at this. And that's awesome. I love being good at stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting that you were able to also take it out of the just kind of software development process because of maybe your background, right?
I can talk intelligently about the work, but I can't do it myself. But I can, but it also is like, I don't know how to build rocket ships. I don't know how to run a manufacturing facility. I know how to help people who do know how to do it better.
So if you had to rename the methodology, so right now it's called Scrum.
Yeah, I would totally love to rename the methodology.
Well, if let's say we're going to rename it.
Okay. What's a really good name? Results. Because I think that the one thing I do see when people really mess up Scrum is they get really into the process rather than the results. And that's what I want. That's one of the things I wrote this book to do, is say, focus on that. The framework is to allow you to get results faster and cheaper. But focus on that.
Has Scrum made you personally better at anything?
Yeah. Focus. Because I was one of those kind of people, like everybody, I think, especially if you're in leadership, you do 10 things at once, right? And you're always being interrupted. And like someone wants your time, especially, this as a leader, someone wants your time all the time. And it's so easy and tempting to go around solving all these little problems because you're good at it, right? But you don't get a lot of the vision stuff done. You don't get the strategy part done because you don't focus on it. And you, at the end of the day, you sort of sit back and say, well, what did I accomplish? Well, I solved a lot of these little problems that really I wasn't needed to solve. Like one of my mentors, this guy named Scott Maxwell, is the founder of a VC firm in Boston, OpenView. And I called him up when I became CEO of Scrum Inc. I said, Scott, you hire and fire CEOs all the time. What should I do? And he goes, I want you to do is take up some Post-it notes and write down everything that you could do and put in one column all the things that someone else could do, that you could hire someone to do. And the other column, only the things that only you can do, and focus on those. Because everything else is a waste of your time. And so, I'm not perfect at it, but that's what I'm trying to do.
JJ, this has been fantastic. It is a great book, the Scrum Fieldbook, The Art of Changing the Possible.
The subtitle got changed. It's the Scrum Fieldbook, a masterclass on accelerating performance, getting results, and defining the future.
Give us your Twitter handle again, your website.
You can find me on Twitter at J.J.Sutherland. Sutherland spelled Sutherland. You can find me on LinkedIn with J.J. Sutherland. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook too, but I never really check. I'm sort of off Facebook, not for any particular reason, but I just never go there anymore. And you can go to scruminc.com, SCRUMINC.com, where you can find more stuff about the books. You can find case studies. You can find, I teach a lot of classes. You can get in touch with us if you want to bring us to help you and your company. Please reach out.
JJ, thank you again. It was good talking to you.
Thank you, Larry.
Well, that is all the time we have today. Please spread the word if you enjoyed the episode. Leave us a review on iTunes and share it with your friends on your favorite social platforms. Big thank you to Sam Williams, my audio guy. Make sure you visit LarryWeeks.com for all my content, and we will talk again soon.